Yo, what's up guys? It's your boy Nitrostorm here. Welcome back to finally the second episode of my priority tier list for 5-star characters, version 2.2 update. I know it's been a while since I made the last one, but here we go. So, just a formality, why am I making this video? So, game has been out for more than 6 months, so there are a lot of 5 stars to consider. Videos on new characters normally talk about how they are good with other 5-star characters, and when you see 5-star character showcases, they are mainly fully built with a certain team composition to maximize the damage dealt by the character that they're trying to showcase. So this causes newer/new players to have mixed feelings on who they should go for. And lastly, I wanted to give newer players a resource that can help guide them in terms of building up a good roster for 5-star characters. Now, for my notes/disclaimers, they are ranked based on mechanics/abilities, their ease of use. So when it comes to ease and use, is stuff like if their mechanics are easy to manage, or if there are things to note when using this character. I will mention that if there's something about them that makes them not easy to use. Now, next part, how much they affect your experience. So in this one, again, it's a very general term, but what I mainly mean by this is if they make things easier for you, or with a little bit of maybe if they're fun to use. And last but not least, their investment required to be quote-unquote good. So what I mean by this is, how good is the character out of the box? As in, the moment you get this character, how effective will their presence be in your Genshin Impact gameplay experience? That's the main gist of what I mean by that. Now, the next bullet point, as I've mentioned before, the rankings may not correlate with tier list based on full potential/strength. So most 5 stars mainly DPS shine when you use with other 5 stars and other supports, hence you have a priority. Furthermore, this tier list is based on my experience. I am an adventure rank 57 launch player, and I'm able to 36 star Abyss, so I would hope that I know what I'm talking about. Next part is intended for newer players, but you can use it if you're a more experienced player, as it does tie in a little bit. And last but definitely not the least, it's in my opinion. So if there are stuff that you kind of disagree with, you can let me know down in the comments, just so I can broaden my horizons and improve this tier list as the banners and new characters keep getting introduced. Now, for a quick excerpt, a little extra, waifu/husbando factor is not included in this tier list, so I deeply apologize for that. And of course, the tier list will update as Genshin Impact/miHoYo introduces new characters. Now, of course, the one thing to note, the overall aim is to make your life and experience easier in Genshin Impact. So we will just quickly go over these changes, and I'll further explain why once we take a look at the full tier list. So just a quick one, Kazuha and Venti, I've brought them up from S rank to SS rank. I've brought up Eula and Zhao from their respective ranks, C and B, to A rank. I raised Child from C rank to B rank. I've lowered Q-Tao from S rank to A rank, and last but not least, I've brought down Mona from A to B rank. Now, if the amount of dislikes have increased because of this slide, then I deeply apologize, but do hear me out once we get to them. And of course, we have new additions, Yoimiya and Raiden at A rank, and Kokomi at B rank. Okay, so we have 2 tier lists. I'll quickly show them both. So this is the priority tier list for an emphasis of 5-star event characters. As you can see, I've placed all the standard banner characters in one tier. Well, not really a tier, but it's just to group them. And this is the priority tier list for all 5 stars. So this is if I were to rank the standard banner characters as well. So for now, let's emphasize on the event characters, as you may be able to pull these standard banner characters trying to pull the event 5 stars. Hence why I put standard banners down there, is because you don't exactly need to focus on pulling them. So moving on to each of these characters, starting with Zhongli. So as I've mentioned previously in the last episode, Zhongli is essentially your full package defensive support with a bit of offensive capabilities. Reason being, as I've mentioned, his Jade Shield both protects you from damage as well as being interrupted because you take no damage, and the shield itself is able to debuff all elemental and physical resistance of nearby enemies, which is huge. His elemental burst is able to petrify enemies for a certain amount of time, giving you some breathing room or just free reign to do damage. And last but not least, the pillars that he summons are able to do something called resonance. So for now, it might be unique to Zhongli forever, but his E is able to resonate, cause resonance, and to describe that, essentially the pillar kind of like does a small burst of AoE damage, and that resonance is able to transfer into other geo constructs that are nearby. So if you have more geo characters and you create geo constructs, for example Albedo's elevator, if the elevator is nearby Zhongli pillar, the resonance will also spread to Albedo's elevator, essentially creating a larger AoE of geo damage. Moving on to Venti and Kazuha. So their roles are kind of similar, but at the same time not really. But essentially these two are now double S because of the amount of elemental support they can give, as well as certain unique traits from each of them. So outside of being huge elemental supports that increase damage for the whole team, Venti is able to scoop up enemies with the elemental burst, which recharges very quickly because his elemental skill gives so much energy. And as I've mentioned, the burst is basically a vacuum, which saves you a lot of time and effort, which is something that I think would be a nice thing to hear as a new player, rather than running around like a huge area trying to defeat all the enemies in time. You can use Venti to bring them all up into one place, so he can deal damage and defeat the enemies in a shorter amount of time. Okay, so moving now on with Kazuha. So the thing with him, outside of being huge elemental damage support, he is also able to scoop up enemies, not as effectively, but his tap E / hold E is able to group up enemies from a certain distance around him, which does help, and his elemental burst has an insane range, making it easier for you to swirl enemies and debuffing them and so on. Last but not least, for all these three characters in double S, they're also easy to invest in. So for Zhongli, for the most part, you can just simply build him all HP to have a strong shield and still do good damage on his burst because it scales depending on his HP relatively. And for Venti and Kazuha, as long as you farm the Viridescent set artifact domain, all they need for their stat is essentially elemental mastery, and they're already good to go. Okay, moving now to S rank, high priority. As you can see, Ganyu is currently on her own. While it may seem like I'm being biased here, we do have good reason why she's up there. Reason being, as a DPS, she is very strong, very good at main DPS, shooting from far away, able to do big damage. And when you're doing reverse melting, it's very effective because the damage she's able to deal in one hit is very high, so when you apply reverse melt, the damage just scales very well. Furthermore, if you don't want to build her as main DPS, or you can't, well, good news, she's able to be a good and very effective cryo burst support. Reason being is that her elemental skill gives a good amount of energy, at the same time attracting enemies, making it easier for you to move around without worrying about getting hit too much. And the duration of her elemental burst is the same number of seconds as her cooldown. Therefore, you're able to keep up a 100% uptime of her elemental burst, which is very good and very nice to have as a cryo support. Okay, so now as you can see, A rank, there's a lot of characters in A rank now, and mostly consisting of DPS, which does make a lot of sense if you look at the bigger picture. So let's start off from left to right. So for Hu Tao, as I've mentioned before, she was in S rank but now brought down to A, mainly because of the fact that she's basically less flexible compared to Ganyu. But her damage output is still insane. Just because I brought her down one doesn't mean her damage is suddenly bad. No, her damage is definitely up there. It's just that normally when you use her, she's, I think, always with Xingqiu, which is a 4-star gacha character. So you're not going to start off with Xingqiu when you start off the game with Hu Tao. So you might not see her effectiveness shine just yet until a bit later on after you've pulled more characters. And mainly because of the fact that her big damage is at the cost of losing HP, and she deals the most damage when she's below 50% HP. But at the same time, while she's below 50% HP, since she scales with HP, even though she's at half HP, she basically has the same HP stat as the max HP of the other DPS you see here. That's why she's still a solid A, nearly S, why she's at the top of the A rank. So next up, we have the second latest addition to Genshin Impact, which is Raiden Shogun. She is the Electro Archon for Inazuma. Well, now that I've said that, Zhongli up here is the Geo Archon for Liyue, and Venti is the Animal Archon for Mondstadt. Okay, now back to Raiden. She is a support battery burst DPS, if that makes any sense. Now, because she fits a lot of roles, or she does a lot of things, you could say that it does kind of hold her back in terms of what she can be if you focus on one job. However, if you do make her C2, then it does alleviate the issue of probably not dealing that much damage as a main DPS, mainly due to the fact that the C2 is broken, ignores 60% of defense during her burst. But in any case, she has a good energy recharge. She scales of energy recharge, meaning you will know for sure that her burst will be available more often and making that more reliable in terms of being a battery for the whole team. And on top of that, she still does good DPS. Now moving on to Eula, so we've brought her up from C rank to A rank, mainly because I think I was too harsh on Eula, because if you look at the early game, physical damage is strong early game, and Eula herself is able to scale well into late game. So in essence, you're able to use Eula from start to quote-unquote finish without having much issue, and her gameplay itself is very straightforward. So a lot of her damage is coming from her normal attacks, so essentially you can just spam normal attacks and you'll do good damage. Furthermore, her E, when you tap E, her elemental skill, she will get a stack that increases her defense as well as increasing her interrupt resistance, meaning you can go unga bunga, just go ham, and you'll do damage without worrying about getting destroyed or getting interrupted. So that's why I've brought Eula up to A. Okay, now moving on to Zhao. So I've brought him up from B to A rank, mainly because of essentially his very straightforward gameplay as well. So essentially, after you press your burst, elemental burst, his gameplay is mainly jump really high and then plunge attack, and then you repeat that and then you do insane damage. Of course, you're pressing E whilst the cooldown is done, so you can get some energy back, but in essence it's very straightforward and also fun to look at. Now he does lose some HP whilst in burst form, so it's not really the end of the world when that happens. All you just need is a healer in the team and you're golden. Now moving on to Ayaka. So Ayaka and Albedo, they both stayed in their spots, so there's not really much to say about them that I've said in the previous video, but essentially Ayaka can be good DPS, but maybe a little bit tricky to use due to how she is always in need of doing the dodge. Her dodge is different. She goes underground, and then when she goes back up after you let go of the dodge button, she will be infused with cryo for a short amount of time, and usually at that point you do your charge attack. So just from hearing that, you might seem like that she might be a bit complicated to use, but no matter, you can use her like Ganyu as a cryo burst DPS support, because her E has very easy to use range where you can just go in the middle of all the enemies, and E having a big range, you'll be able to hit a lot of enemies for some good damage, as well as being able to gain a lot of cryo energy particles. And then her elemental burst will for sure charge up relatively fast. Just need to keep in mind that you do need to aim the elemental burst, otherwise you might miss, so keep that in mind. Next up we have Albedo. Again, as I've mentioned, he stayed in A from the last tier list, so there's not much to say about him. He's essentially free damage. You place his elemental skill down the elevator, hit an enemy within the range of the elevator, and you get free damage. And then his elemental burst is just a short animation, but again, more free damage. The one thing to keep in mind about Albedo is that the elemental skill might break easily or might despawn due to larger enemies. It's the similar issue for Zhongli's pillar, but it's a bigger issue for Albedo because if it breaks, it's essentially negative DPS for Albedo, because without that E, he's not essentially participating in helping the team. Next up, last but not least, we have Yoimiya for A rank. Now, I guess you could say it's kind of controversial, mainly because there's a lot of good and bad sides to her. Like, her elemental burst is essentially kind of useless to Yoimiya herself, so it's a plus and a minus. It's a minus because her burst is useless, right? I think it's usable, but I think it's negative DPS if you use it, if I remember correctly. But because of that, you only need to focus on her elemental skill, and her gameplay is so simple. So you do elemental skill and then you spam normal attacks. So what this means is that you have a lot of stamina spare to dodge enemy attacks, and then you just need to spam normal attacks to deal pyro damage, which is very nice. Now, moving on to rank B, so we have Qiqi, who stayed in the same spot. Now, Qiqi does a lot of damage, possibly more than Yoimiya, because her burst is actually useful. It's just that in order for you to utilize her full potential in terms of damage, you're going to have to learn some animation cancelling. But if you're the type of guy that likes that sort of mechanics, then Qiqi would be rated up higher because she does do a lot of damage. I'm not sure if it's as much as Hu Tao, but Hu Tao has good burst snapshot damage, and Qiqi is more so, you know, consistent DPS. But overall, Qiqi's staying where she is because it does make sense. Good damage, hard to use, and that's about it. Next up, we have Child, well, Tartaglia, who we have brought up from rank C to rank B, mainly because Child himself is still pretty decent on his own. Just need to keep in mind his gameplay, where if you use his dual swords form for too long, the cooldown on that E is a bit insane in a bad way. So meaning you have to like use him for like switch gameplay, where you use him, press E, attack for a little bit, and then switch out. And for Child's, I guess, staple team, it uses certain characters, hence why he's a bit lower in the priority scale, because you'd want to raise that specific team in order for Child to essentially shine. However, the good news for Child, why I brought him up from C to B, is that we do get Xiangling for free after you hit Adventure Rank 20 and clear a certain floor in Abyss. Therefore, you essentially have 2 out of 4 characters ready for the Child team. And then last but not least, for the event characters, we have Kokomi at B rank. So essentially for Kokomi, it's mainly due to I guess a multitude of things. So firstly, she heals very well. I think a bit too well for the current state of Genshin Impact. Now, it does sound like a really good thing for newer players because your team's not gonna die. But at the same time, I do have to keep in mind like the presence she has on the team, or like how much she helps, because outside of healing, she doesn't really do that much. Now, she can be used in a similar sense to Tartaglia, because she is hydro, you know, water. Essentially, if you don't have Tartaglia, you could use Kokomi as a replacement to essentially be the hydro enabler. So that's what Tartaglia is. They're both hydro enablers, and that's why Child isn't rated higher, because rather than being the character to proc elemental reactions, he's the one that sets up the base element for other characters to react with, if that makes any sense. As in, Child shines, the better your supports are. Hence why he's lower priority. Similar sense for Kokomi, you'd want good characters to be with her in the team in order to have good DPS whilst utilizing Kokomi's hydro element and survivability. So that's everyone for the event characters. Now let's move on to the standard characters. So in case you guys didn't see where the standard characters are. Diluc is at A rank, as you can see at the edge here. Mona and Jean are on B rank. And last but not least, you have Keqing and Qiqi at rank C. So we'll quickly go over Mona first because she's the only one that's moved from A to B. Now, the reason why we've put Mona from A to B is that she's still, like, for example, Ayaka is not that easy to use if you use her as main DPS. But Mona, I think in general, is not that easy to use anyway. Now, of course, you see a lot of videos, insane number of videos using Mona, you know, like Mona OP and stuff because of her Omen buff and so on. But you do have to keep in mind the characters that are used alongside Mona that helps Mona shine. Now, for the most part, Mona shines the most in freeze compositions because the Omen buff from her elemental burst is prolonged because of the fact that it's not popping. Because freeze doesn't exactly pop the elemental burst. What normally pops it is stuff like any other element, really. Like if you place a pyro element on the enemy inside, the Omen buff will go, the elemental burst will pop, dealing huge hydro damage vaporized thanks to the pyro. But if it's frozen, it doesn't really pop, if you know what I mean. So you're able to prolong the damage buff, able to buff the damage of your freeze composition. So all in all, she shines more when you have certain characters, and on her own, she's not really the easiest to use. Also keep in mind that her dodge is similar to Ayaka, where they go underground. In her case, it's Hydro, and in Ayaka's case, it's Cryo. And you have to keep in mind that you can't really dodge with the unique movement, so you have to keep that in mind as well. Okay, so moving back to Diluc. So I've put him in A because he's very easy to use. He gains a lot of energy because you can use his elemental skill 3 times, and his elemental burst can potentially have a 100% uptime depending on your team. But I think for the most part, he can spam his burst on his own even without any recharge investment, making him pretty fun to play because it's so easy. Moving on to Jean. So she stayed at B rank. Again, another healer, but she is Anemo, so she can provide viridescent support as well, debuffing the certain elemental resistance of the enemies, boosting your team's damage. It's just that I do have some issues with the range of her Q. It's not that big, but if you just use it for healing, it does help. And her burst, the main job for it is to deal damage and pushes enemies away, which is kind of like the opposite of what Venti and Kaza does. So it might not be to your like. However, she is very effective in healing, and her elemental skill does pull enemies towards her as long as you hold E for long enough, and then when you let go, it's huge animal damage. Now moving on to Keqing and Qiqi. So Keqing is low priority mainly because she is a focused main DPS for Electro, and Electro normally, if you've seen like I guess tutorials, is that their elemental reactions aren't really the best suited for DPS because for the most part the damage of the elemental reactions scale only through elemental mastery. But if you do that, the overall DPS of Keqing will essentially not be as high as if you were to build her like a normal DPS with attack percent and elemental damage. But you could build her physical, it's just that it might be a bit awkward to use. So essentially, that's why I put Keqing down there. She is kind of easy to use, I guess, you know, she can teleport, but if you hold the elemental skill, you can choose where to place the sigil before you press it again to teleport. So it does make you think a lot about how to use Keqing, which might not be a thing that you guys might want at this moment. And then last but not least, we have Qiqi at low priority as well. She is basically one of the strongest healers in the game, but essentially that's the only thing she does. Her elemental burst, if you use it, it does apply like a certain debuff to an enemy, where if another character attacks the enemy, they themselves will recover a lot of HP. The only issue is that the elemental burst of Qiqi recharges a bit too slow. Her elemental skill does apply cryo damage a few hits over time, and during that time, if Qiqi does normal attack damage, the whole team will recover HP based on Qiqi's attack. So essentially she can bring the team back to full HP on her own, which is pretty nice, but again, that's just her own thing. She only heals. Now of course, if you do get Qiqi, you can raise her. but since she's low priority, all you need to do is just to give her enough attack. You don't really need to invest like a good set or good anything on her to make her effective in healing. So that's pretty much the whole tier list explained. If you do have any more questions regarding certain characters, please do let me know down in the comments, so hopefully I can explain that to you. We'll just go over the tiers, as in like a TLDR for those that didn't want to go through the whole video just like that, because you know it might be too long for you guys. I just want like a brief explanation. Well, here's a TLDR. So at double S rank, we have Zhongli, Venti, and Kazuha. All three are essentially insane supports that will basically fit into any team, except for Venti and Kazuha, they prefer elemental teams. Ganyu is high priority because huge damage and can be used as a support burst, making her very flexible and still do good damage. Now for A rank, good to have, we have a long list. Hu Tao, very good damage, not as flexible as Ganyu, but still very good damage, and you do need to keep her HP below 50% to utilize her full potential. Raiden, good battery, good electro damage, not essentially the best for main DPS unless you get constellations, but overall she is good, a little bit held back due to her electro element. Eula, good physical DPS. Because of physical DPS, she's able to scale well from early game all the way to late game. Simple to use and good damage. Might need to be close to enemies to ensure that her hits and attacks hit the enemies. Zhao, again, good DPS, simple to use, does lose some HP over time after burst, so keep that in mind. Ayaka, again, good DPS, slightly harder to use as a main DPS, but as support, good energy on E, might need to aim a bit on her elemental burst, but very good damage. Albedo, essentially free damage, place E down, hit enemy in the E range, deal damage, and elemental burst is free damage. Just keep in mind of his elevator disappearing so that you don't deal negative DPS and Albedo not participating in the battle. Yoimiya, very easy to use, but her elemental burst is relatively useless for Yoimiya, but in turn makes her gameplay very simple. Press E, spam normal attacks, and you're done. Diluc, standard banner character, keep that in mind, but very easy to use. Can spam your elemental burst for free damage, infusing himself with pyro, so very consistent, very easy pyro DPS, but he might start to fall off at late game, but he's still very consistent. Klee has the potential to deal more damage than Yoimiya and Diluc, but harder to use, needs to learn animation cancelling, stuff like that, but you could say fun to use, you know, fun to master, I guess. Child, very good DPS for someone that is a Hydro enabler, needs good supports to utilize the Hydro element that he inflicts on the enemies in order to effectively maximize the damage. Kokomi heals the team a bit too much, but can be used potentially as a substitute for Child if you don't have him to be the Hydro enabler, as well as having a failsafe due to her heal. Jean, another good healer, can use the Viridescent set to debuff enemies' elemental resistance. The range of her elemental burst might be a bit off-putting, and it does push enemies away, so keep that in mind, but her elemental skill can pull enemies towards you, and the damage of that elemental skill is very strong. Mona, mainly used as a support for freeze compositions which require other characters for her to shine, and on her own she might be a bit difficult to use. Keqing, being an electro main DPS, does hinder her quite a bit, but her gameplay itself is not exactly that bad. She can recharge her burst pretty well and do decent damage overall, just held back by electro and the reactions that she could cause. And last but not least, Qiqi, another very strong healer, but that's essentially all that she does. No support in other means. Okay, so that's a TLDR done. Hopefully you guys have a better understanding of the current 5-star characters that are out at the moment. Now, we do know that there are other 5 stars coming soon, but obviously they're not out yet, so I can't really disclose. So this is the tier list for version 2.2. Hopefully you found this useful, or at least gave you a better understanding on what kind of characters to look for in terms of making your life easier in Genshin Impact. And I would also advise to check out the proper, I guess, tier list in terms of like just main DPS, sub DPS, and support. And then you can cross check on both to see which one you really want to get, and so on. It's been your boy Nitrostorm. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next stream or video. Peace.